Hey everybody, this is Shane Mauss with the Here We Are podcast. We just started doing. My guest today is Shawn Green, who's been a past guest, and going to tell you about him in a moment. We just started doing video casts for the first time in my 5.5 year history, and then I also just got this fancy new webcam, and then I realized the downside of all of this is now people can really see just how hungover I am on the first I had my first night of blowing off some steam during the apocalypse last night. Shawn, how have you been? How's your quarantine been?
I probably like everyone else's, if I had to guess. School has been shut down since spring break. The University of Wisconsin has been shut down since spring break. So moving everything online was certainly a challenge, but it seems like it's worked as smoothly as it could have possibly gone. So, people are adjusting as best as possible, I think.
Cool. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So my research is really interested in learning pretty broadly construed. So a lot of the research that we do looks at whether you can learn to improve your cognitive skills, say through playing certain types of video games. We also look at whether you can learn to improve your visual skills through kind of dedicated training with an eye towards people who have certain types of deficits like lazy eye.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on. You were on, I think, season 1 or something like that of the Here We Are podcast. It was some time ago, and talking about video games. Had a terrific conversation. And then you were on the very first ever stand-up science, which I didn't know when you were first on it was going to kind of become my full-time gig. And in trying to get as many different views on kind of quarantines and viruses and everything that's happening, I thought, what a great take on things now that everyone's at home watching the most TV, playing the most video games and everything else that they've ever had. I thought that I'd have you on because there was I don't, I haven't listened back. I don't remember our entire conversation or anything from the first time I had you on 4 or 5 years ago, but certainly one takeaway that I do have from it is that you aren't as panicked about video game addiction as kind of the general population had kind of started to be in the last, say, 10, 15 years or so. And I think this is a very, very unique situation because there's a whole lot of parents being like, oh yeah, video games, I'm sure they're fine. Just set the kids in front of these video games. So what's your take on what's going on now, the increased volume of consumption, video game interaction, watching Twitch, watching Netflix? Is this an opportunity for you to collect some interesting new data? And do you have any kind of unique takes on what's going on and maybe even predictions about how this might change culture?
Yeah, sure. I think video games, the way that we conceptualize them is they're kind of, we use them as a tool, a tool to purposely change behavior, but just by their design, they are good at changing behavior. But that alone is neutral. So, you can kind of design video games that change behavior in a way that you would think is good, and probably can design video games to change behavior in a way that you would think is less good. I think the interest with respect to video games right now is that, they can kind of fill some of the holes that people are otherwise experiencing. There's been a big kind of rush towards more online video game play. Obviously, people are suffering from lack of social interaction. this type of gaming can fill the void, whether it's the type of video games that people think of when they think of video games like Fortnite or, League of Legends, all the way through things like, my parents-in-law are playing a lot of online euchre now, kind of filling that.
For our nationwide listeners, euchre is a very Midwest-specific card game that's a lot like spades.
Yeah, so what's funny about euchre is that where I went to grad school is about the other place that I've seen in the United States where people play it. That Rochester area, people also play euchre. That's where I learned to play it, and then I came here. I was like, hey, people know this game. So yes, it is a trump game. But beyond the simple social things, I think there are other kind of social or kind of internal needs that video games can fill that we're all kind of suffering from. So there's really nice work showing that video games can fill the need for what they call autonomy. Just the idea that people have this need to be able to make purposeful decisions in their life. They get to kind of choose for themselves how things will play out.
Interesting.
All kind of stuck in a world right now where we don't get to make as many purposeful choices as we used to.
Oh my gosh. That's such an interesting point, and knowing from the and sorry to cut you off, but the kind of the basics of stress research is that the two main stressors in life is lack of predictability and lack of control. I mean, that's oversimplifying things, but those are the two main stressors. And I hadn't really thought about that as video games as a powerful tool for even on a I mean, kind of, maybe I shouldn't say placebo level, giving people that sense of control over things.
Yeah, I think so, right? It's suddenly, if nothing else, you can make purposeful decisions about the kind of trajectory that your avatar takes through, right? You suddenly have options in front of you and kind of meaningful choices. It's like my choices are mainly, am I going to eat pasta again, or are we going to dive into the freezer, right? Like, these are the choices. In the games, especially the more kind of open world games, there's a lot of kind of freedom in a way that we're kind of feeling a little bit restricted now. So it's certainly something that we're interested in. I think like a lot of people who study technology and media and human interactions with technology and media, it's, how is technology filling some of these gaps? And then kind of planning on seeing, well, will this continue in the future? If people have started to use video games to fill some of these needs that they wouldn't have otherwise used video games for, will they continue to do so in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it is from my first video game being, Nintendo, like Super Mario Brothers way back in like 1985 or something like that, when I first got my hands on a controller, maybe 84. The way in which you can build a world now, even as simple as my friend Jake Baker that I often stay with when I'm in LA, one of the things that I've never fully understand, but it's just like a thing that he does, is he's on like one of the NBA games, and he doesn't play. He doesn't play the games. He sits and fiddles with the characters and spends hours after hour like creating different characters, like figuring out like how to make them look like their different like ethnic background, looking up like popular names in this country that like he's less familiar with, and figuring out like what this person's name should be, what their height should be, all of these different, and he just builds these like characters as realistic as possible, and then runs simulations of game. He doesn't even play, or he puts it in like whatever coach mode or whatever, and goes outside and sees like who wins in these matches.
Yeah, I know that customization, I mean, it's just another good example of like meaningful choice, right? Like suddenly you get some choices of things, so there's a pretty big, and it does, it's certainly filling sports gaps for lots of people. I've been playing a lot of MLB The Show to fill my baseball gap. My guess is that, my Cubs team, it's going to be more successful than the real Cubs this year. The hope is that they'll be successful this year. Season happens.
Yeah.
But kind of filling, for me, come April, it's baseball time, and so that's a lack that I'm experiencing, and so video can fill that niche as well.
Right. Yeah. That's so. Boy, I love talking with scientists. I think of a new point and a new take on this every single episode. This is so cool. So, what about? I may have talked to you about this. I remember. So the audience is going to have to excuse my ignorance. The reason why I don't know much about video games is because I love them so much that if I were to play a video game, my life is just over and I can't do anything else. And so I just completely have to abstain from video games altogether. And I won't bore the audience with examples that I've given in the past, but it's a real true self-control issue for me. But I remember reading about video games. That's as close as I can get to video games, is reading about them and hearing about how wonderful they are without actually playing them myself. But there's some game that was that's kind of about where you're able to go through space, and it's modeled based on astrological data using our solar system. And there's even physicists that have learned lessons about the universe by like playing this game and being like, wait, this meteor or whatever isn't the trajectory that we would expect it to be. Is it this video games model, or is it our model and understanding that's wrong? Maybe there could be a world envisioned where there's a virology game or something on the horizon that would allow people to play and understand viruses and what's happening now on a new level.
I was gonna say, there is a very well-known game called Plague Inc. And pretty much anytime something like this pops up, there is certainly demand for them. The issue is that your goal in that game is to spread the virus. You are the virus. It's teaching some problematic lessons.
Encouraging empathy for viruses.
Yeah.
Huh.
If I was a virus, how would I maximally spread? I'd probably, hope that, people don't lock down their states and social distance, kinds of things.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, that is fascinating. So I remember you. Why don't you reshare the study that you did about the peripheral vision? Because then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, so in the part of my lab's research where we look at kind of training people to improve either their cognitive skills or their visual skills, in particular, we've looked at training on one specific kind of game. One of the big kind of take-home messages for the research on video games is that video games is a category that's just so broad that it's not particularly scientifically predictive, right? We're thinking of a category that includes everything from Flappy Bird and Angry Birds through, Red Dead Redemption 2 and, Horizon Zero Dawn, these kind of giant open world games. And so the analogy I use really commonly is video games are, as a category are like food as a category, right? It's like, oh, is it good or bad to eat food? Well, it kind of depends.
Right.
And so the game that we look at, or the game type that we look at, we call action video games. And these are primarily first-person and third-person shooter games. And so what we've seen is that if you take people who don't ordinarily play these games and kind of purposely train them on them, in our case, they come to the lab and they play these games in a lab setting, an hour a day, 5 days a week. And you measure their, say, peripheral vision before and after the training, you see kind of improvements in the people that play these action video games that you don't see in people who are trained in the equivalent way on other types of games that, say, don't place demands on peripheral vision. So, for instance, we've used as a control game The Sims, which is kind of a life simulation game, which doesn't really have any peripheral visual demands.
So the outcome being that if this increases peripheral vision, perhaps one of the unforeseen outcomes of say playing a first-person shooter is that when you're say driving in Wisconsin and a deer is about to cross the road, maybe you'll notice that deer crossing earlier if you have improved peripheral vision.
Yeah, so one of the tests that we've used, it's called the useful field of view, and it was actually originally designed to assess driving accident risk, and particularly in the elderly. So the types of vision tests that we get, at least in the state of Wisconsin, to get your driver's license. So like, read this line on the eye chart, and then there's a little peripheral dot that you have to say when it comes on, which happens to sit right where my glasses are, so I could never see this dot. Those aren't particularly predictive of driving accidents, at least, until you have really bad vision, largely because people don't tend to run into things that they're looking directly at. The places where driving accidents occur are when you don't notice something, say, in your peripheral vision. And so, this psychology test, the useful field of view, it does a better job of predicting kind of driving accidents than kind of more standard, what people would think of as like eye chart vision. And it's one of the measures that we've seen is enhanced from playing this type of action video game.
Huh. Amazing. And I'm trying to remember, there has been some studies about video games potentially increasing dexterity in surgeons, if I'm remembering this right.
Yeah, so there's a couple of teams that have looked at, if we think of in particular like endoscopic surgery, it has a lot of clear touch points with how a video game would work, right? You're kind of manipulating something with your hands that then is affecting something on a screen. It's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping in terms of how far you move your hand and how far the thing in the kind of on the screen moves. And so there's a number of teams who have largely done what we think of as correlational work. They basically asked surgeons, how much video gaming do you do? And then they tested them largely in surgical simulators to say, well, is it the people, that are playing lots of video games that happen to be really good at doing some of these simulators? As far as I know, there might be work in actual surgeries, but actual surgeries are kind of scientifically difficult, to control. And
Right.
So, yeah, that work has said that the people who are more avid gamers, or the surgeons who are more avid gamers, perform better on the simulators that are meant to simulate real surgery. And in particular, they tend to be faster at completing the exercises without making more errors. And just the amount of time that you are kind of inside someone's body is related to the possible complications. And so being able to kind of do things that much faster without making more errors has a lot of value.
Do you think that it's possible that it's just people with like natural, maybe kind of genetic, higher than average hand motor function that find themselves drawn to doing that kind of work and find themselves drawn to playing video games simply because they're good at it?
Yeah, so pretty much anyone who's kind of had a science class at some point has had drilled into them that correlation, doesn't mean causation or can't be used to imply causation. In the case of our research, kind of, we do the correlation study where we just ask, what do you do in your real life? And, do you play lots of action video games or not? And then we measure visual skills, and we ask, do the people who choose to play the games show better visual skills than the people who don't? But as you note, we don't know if that's pre-existing or if it's caused by the games. And so we always do kind of dedicated true experiments in the lab where we take people who don't choose to play those games naturally and train them on action games. That way we can know that the experience causes a change in behavior.
Right.
My guess in the real world is that it's probably a mixture of both. Is that people tend to choose to do things that they are good at. There's actually really nice theories in motivation psychology saying more or less that. And then the types of activities that people engage in, often they'll improve at those, right? And it'll cause, it'll then itself cause changes in their behavior. So my guess in the real world is it's a little bit of kind of natural skill, and it's a little bit of, playing these games is altering behaviors as well.
Do you see any game that would be kind of particularly good for situations right now that people aren't driving as much? I mean, it's great if doctors are maybe better at surgery, but that's a few cases out there. What about things like again, excuse my ignorance, but what is today's version of like the Nintendo Wii or is there still a Nintendo Wii?
I mean, it still exists. The newest one is the Switch for Nintendo.
The Switch.
You pretty much have the same, at least 3 core ones. There's Nintendo's, which is Switch now. PlayStation is up to the 4, and then the Xbox, which is Microsoft's, is Xbox One.
So are games like that, and now that people are kind of hunkered down, do you think those are going to take off? Do you think that they are? Do you think that they are a decent supplement for? I mean, people can still, depending on where they are, still go out and take hikes and things like that, and get sunlight, which is going to be the best thing for people. But people in certain situations, do you think that that a game like that is a decent supplement for exercise?
I mean, I think there are some types of games, and there's a pretty big field that's interested in, what we call exergames, basically, right? Like they're exercise-specific video games. I think there are people who are in parts of the country, right, that getting out and exercising is more difficult. And so, there's been a proliferation of, how do people get exercise at home in kind of limited space. And so my guess is that some of those games will become popular, right? And to the extent that they, increase heart rate for 20 minutes, they should have the types of benefits that go along with that. And the nice thing about the exergames is that, one big problem for, kind of staying on exercising is that in many cases it's not that fun. And right. So, that's kind of one of the big veins of research in that domain is, does the rewarding nature of the video game kind of allow more persistent behavior than you get if you were just going to, jump rope or, I've spent 4 weeks with my rower down in the basement, these kinds of things.
Interesting. So kids are out of school. People are trying to teach remotely and everything. Parents are finding themselves, as much as parents love getting to spend time with their children, a lot of parents are also trying to work from home at the same time. And I've talked recently on the episode of kind of this, the work and the home life bleeding together quite a bit, and having a hard time establishing boundaries and keeping a new schedule. And one of the potential outcomes of this is like we criticize using the TV as a babysitter, but there are going to be people in situations where just the reality of it is that you need some space to get some work done, to put food on the table, and also you have a kid at home. What would you say are some of the most positive alternatives, or not alternatives, options for parents that need to plop their kids in front of a video game for a while?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the advice I usually give, I kind of shy away from giving specific game advice and kind of give broader advice, especially because lots of times it'll depend on the child's interests. The general advice I give is to just make sure you know what the game content is. Often, I give lots of talks around Wisconsin, at libraries and, middle schools and high schools. And often, the parents will say, oh, is it okay if my kids play video games? And I'll say, well, which ones? And they might say something like, oh, it has like this kind of, spiky haired guy on the box. And I'm like, I don't know which one that is. You kind of need to kind of get into it and pay attention. Is there content in there that you like? Is there content in there that you don't like?
Interesting. Yeah.
Is your child playing with friends that they know, or are they just playing with random people on the internet? If they're playing with random people on the internet, is there any type of monitoring? Does the child know how to interact with strangers on the internet? There's kind of a lot of steps that a parent would want to go through before doing that, right? Because given the space of, if you give a kid a tablet or a console, they can do a lot of things through video games, many of which the parents probably wouldn't necessarily want them to be doing. And so kind of paying that level of attention, I think is useful. And one thing I've suggested in that is that it can be kind of a nice opportunity for the parent to interact with the child, because children love knowing more than their parents. And so, they like, whatever the equivalent, like child-splaining. I don't know if that's a thing, but, explaining to parents.
We can start it, child-splaining.
Yeah, something like that, right? I do Big Brothers Big Sisters, and my little loves to explain video games to me, which at some point he'll be old enough to kind of recognize the irony of that. At the moment, like he absolutely loves doing that, right? And so, it can actually be a nice experience because it's a domain in which the kid is kind of the teacher, and there's kind of work to that effect.
This is interesting. Yeah, I feel like you're positioned. You have yourself positioned pretty well for our new quarantined world. You're a video game researcher. You're hunkered down with video games, and you already have your hair growing out. As the rest of us are wondering how we're going to cut our hair and can't go to the barber shop anymore. You already have that taken care of.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I'm going to end up with like my graduate school length. Usually come summer, I at least go back to shoulder length, and but I'm not suffering as much as those who need legitimate haircuts for sure.
Yeah. What about any of the sim kind of games out there? Do you think that is there anything out there that you think would be interesting in terms of exploring and learning about maybe how policy is made and how how ecosystems work, how governments work? Is there anything out there like that?
Sure. I mean, there's certainly like a space of what we call serious games that would kind of try to do those things. There's actually a game that it doesn't really necessarily teach how, well, I guess it does. There's a game, I forgot exactly what it's called. It's about gerrymandering. And so your explicit goal in some of the levels is to like, you want to protect two incumbents. So draw these lines, take in this data and draw these lines.
Interesting.
Your party holds the governorship and you want to get as many seats as you can.
Wow.
So the goal is to draw the line so that you get 5 of the 6 House seats. I actually think that that's an incredibly clever game. If I can find it, I'll send you a link to it.
Oh, please do. That is so interesting.
And I actually find it fun to play. Like it's a well done. I mean, it's on a serious topic, but is well done as a game. It has like a game motivation structure where it's like, here's the rules and here's your goal as a player in this. And you kind of get this sense of like what's fair and what's not when you are doing things that are inherently unfair to win this game. It's like, sorry, folks, we're diluting your votes, but I'm going to win this level.
Is our new versions of Sims going to include like a pandemic just happened and you need to quarantine all of your Sims?
Yeah, people, it's like given the modding community for games, I'd be surprised if there weren't weren't mods as is. Now rather than just watching your sim, now your sim can't even leave the house. Before they at least pretended to go to work for part of the day.
Huh. Yeah. What kind of games are you into?
I play a lot of what I guess you might call kind of action role-playing games. That's the genre that I play the most. Right now I'm playing a couple of games, like, speaking of kind of social aspects of games, the two games I'm playing right now, I'm playing because I play them with my younger brother, who's a paramedic in Florida. And so we don't really have a call and chat on the phone kind of relationship. But if we're both playing the same online game, we kind of talk about the game, but talk about some other things, right? It provides a nice outlet to just chat, even in the context. So we are right now playing a game called Don't Starve Together, which, as it sounds, it's kind of like a survival game. You try to not starve or get killed by anything while gathering resources and, building a little home base.
What are the potential downsides of video games? Is there anything that people are going to want to be especially mindful of in the current conditions?
Sure. You kind of start off by talking about video game addiction. I'm at least of the belief that, this is, that there are a subset of people who play video games in a way that is kind of unhealthy for their life. They, will play video games to the point that they give up other aspects of their life that, they're, in the case of college students, which is what we worry the most about, they're not doing their assignments. They're not interacting with others. In really severe cases, they'll start to kind of have poor hygiene or sleep issues. And so, that's always a concern. Estimates of what percent of people who play games have kind of these symptoms kind of ranges really broadly from part of a percent to maybe 5%.
Right. And I don't want to highlight kind of statistical anomalies and bring up people's kind of recency bias or whatever by using one example, but I know a guy who because I didn't know the world of how to like make money playing video games, and I met a guy, we were chatting about it. He said that when he was when he was doing like tons of World of Warcraft stuff, and he was doing a lot of like tutorials and stuff, people could pay him to give a tutorial and things, but then like these treasures in like World of Warcraft where he'd find out where some treasure was, and then it was going to like repopulate at some point, and he had to hunker down, and he'd have to like take Adderall and like have a bucket to go to the bathroom because he needed to be able to like fight off any potential people that are coming there and be there the very moment that this like treasure repopulates, so that he could sell that online. So that's an exceptionally extreme example that I'm sure it's like 0.00001% of gamers out there. But when you mentioned hygiene, that story occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, there are a subset of people who, go along those routes. Sleep is very commonly a thing that people give up first. They play video games and they don't sleep enough. They don't do homework if they're kids. They'll miss work assignments. So there is certainly a segment of people that play games in a way that's unhealthy. So within the American system, video game addiction is not a formal diagnosis. So the kind of governing body that determines these things hasn't listed it as a formal kind of psychological disorder. It's basically a disorder in need of more research. But if it was a disorder, it would kind of sit right alongside pathological gambling, right? There's a segment of people, who gamble in a way that is just really unhealthy. Lots of people go to casinos, they think it's fun, they lose some money, they go home, they tell their stories. And then there's a segment of people who gamble in a way that's super unhealthy.
Right.
And so that's kind of the common analogy, at least,
Mm-hmm.
to video game addiction.
Now, say that you're a healthy gamer, or I mean, considering just how much television the average person watches, and I mean, I don't know what an unhealthy amount of gaming would be compared to just what seems to me to be an unhealthy amount of TV that just like the average population of the U.S. is watching. I'm curious, are there any studies showing any kind of difference between this? I've talked about passive versus active leisure, and on the podcast before, in the kind of studies that show that psychologically, usually people report having a higher sense of well-being having had an active experience rather than a leisure. So rather than just sitting back and passively watching television, going for a hike or something, and video games is something that is an active, in most cases, an active experience. Is there any? Have you seen any studies comparing the two experiences and possibly well-being comparisons?
So yeah, I mean, apples to oranges comparison, it's basically apples to oranges comparison. It's hard to do an apples to apples comparison.
Right.
In terms of the extent to which people, let's say in my core research, people certainly kind of show more perceptual and cognitive benefits if they play rather than if they watch. As you might expect, right? If you're not actively playing, you're not making predictions, you're not generating errors that you then try to improve on. Kind of all of the things that active means. But my expectation, just kind of returning to one of the earlier points, is that active in the world of video games also means meaningful choices and autonomy. It means there's another. So all of this is kind of vested in what's called self-determination theory, but that people care about autonomy, which is meaningful choices. They care about social relatedness. We're social creatures, and then they care about competence. Right? Like, we have this need to kind of feel like we are competent at things, that we can do things well. And video games are a really nice example where you can grow competence really quickly. Like the example I give in my class sometimes is if you're playing The Sims, right? You have to read a book like 4 times and suddenly you're a physicist, right? You can kind of grow competence very, very quickly. And, that's going to kind of satisfy some basic psychological needs.
When so you, as puzzles are the most popular that they've been in my lifetime, and everyone's showing Instagram pictures of all the puzzles and stuff that they're working on. When you take a game, and I forget the category of what's the title of the category of the game that you were into.
Like that I play myself, action role-playing games.
Action role-playing. No, is that... So that's like, I remember my friend JQ was once playing a Batman game where he like went around, there's like tasks, and so is that what?
So that would probably fit in there. Basically, the idea is that there's some action components. Often you're going around and shooting bad guys, but you're also improving your character, and you can customize your character, and there's some amount of exploration. So it's kind of a amalgamation of those kind of different types of games. You both go around and you do the shooting part, but you also try to customize your character and build up their statistics and these kinds of things.
So obviously you're maybe going to be a hair biased, and I can understand the answer, but I'd love to hear your reasoning. And it's kind of a little redundant here, but speaking of apples to oranges comparisons, we did kind of video games to TV. What about video games to just run-of-the-mill puzzles?
Puzzles will, certainly, give you, say, in a sense of achievement, right? There's a nicety that something was disorderly and now is orderly. I don't know of any actual research on that. There very well might be in the case of puzzles, but, to some extent, the fact that so many people like to play puzzles suggests that they satisfy some psychological need. Just like the existence of them suggests that they provide value to people in some way. You know, obviously the media are very, very different. Usually what we end up saying, and the way that I've been trying to live my life, is that variety is what people really like in the end. So for instance, you know, using video games as one of the things to keep you kind of cognitively engaged, but probably not the sole thing, right? Mixtures of things. You know, if you can take a walk, if you can play some video games, do a puzzle, read a book, that's probably going to be what's best, rather than try to put all your eggs in one particular basket.
So are there any, considering the new kind of quarantine conditions, that I personally believe is going to be a bit more than you know, a few weeks. I think that's a kind of common knowledge at this point. But are there any? Have you seen any opportunities for study with your research, specifically kind of taking advantage of the new you know, these exceptionally bizarre new conditions that humanity's in?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it has certainly spurred in kind of my area of psychology a big push towards doing online data collection. You know, obviously, we can't do any in-person data collection, and so kind of solving the problem of how do you kind of take measures of perception and cognition online, how do you kind of train people on things. So we have a study that we're starting where the intention was that they would come in with, and we'd give them a tablet that had our training software on it, and they would take it home and they would use it. You know, now it's, well, we have to deploy it to individuals' tablets to do the training at home. But I think it'll end up being a positive experience, because, or a positive for the field, because it'll kind of broaden the horizons of the type of people that we can test. We can test people online. So rather than just the people that are in the intro psych classes at the University of Wisconsin, suddenly we have a much bigger chunk of people. So this is really kind of spurred the investment in doing that. It's not a minimal investment to be able to do that translation, but this particular situation has spurred it, and I think it'll be positive in the end.
Interesting. So what do you have any other kind of tips or anything that people should be mindful of, or even any good video game recommendations for folks that are like, you know, I've been thinking about getting into this gaming stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I guess the one tip is that I very commonly run into, say, parents who are like, oh, well, my kid likes video games, but they're just not for me. And often what I've found is that the issue is what we call entrance cost. Like, you know, when you're first playing a video game, especially if you didn't grow up with games, like really our generation, like you mentioned Nintendo, it's probably the first generation that legitimately grew up with this as a medium. You know, there's this cost where you don't know how anything works, and it's a little frustrating at first. But if you kind of push through that, I've found that most people could find games that they do like. So I actually bought a Switch this winter for my wife for Christmas, and she's been playing a game called Zelda Breath of the Wild for about 3 months now. She was always saying that she was not a gamer, and now I guarantee if I look at my house, there's a clipboard of stuff that she needs to find in this game. So, you know, my experience is, at least, you know, most people will find some games that they like if they actually just try it. It's often that entrance cost of being intimidated, or, you know, being frustrated in the beginning because you've never held a controller before, that you just got to kind of push through that part. And then, yeah, there ends up, you know, being a game for most people, I'd say.
All right. Well, let's last thing. Would you mind breaking down the different types of video game categories that there are, and maybe even is this quite a task? Am I putting you on the spot right now? a little bit.
A little bit. I mean, I just mainly don't want to get yelled at by people. And obviously, people in the gaming world have kind of strong opinions about these things.
Yeah, they do. Well, throw a little more fuel on that fire, and throw out a couple of your favorites in each.
Hey, as long as everyone, any complaints should be sent along to Shane and not to me.
Yeah. I'll take your complaints.
I would say, so like the questionnaire that we use in our lab, we divide things into first and third person shooter games, right? These are kind of as they sound. Either it's first person shooter, you're looking through your character's eyes and usually shooting at things, or third person, you're looking at the back of your character and shooting. That's kind of a broad swath of games that would fall in that. There's kind of the role-playing adventure types of games where you're kind of building your character, you're exploring. There's the sports driving games. We kind of glom those into one big category, all the sports games, all the kind of car driving games. There's the strategy, or there's a popular genre called MOBAs, multiplayer online battle arena. So League of Legends is a very kind of popular game that's in that genre. There's the life simulation games like The Sims, or I'd probably put like Animal Crossing, that I know a new version came out recently that lots of people have been spending time with. There's music games like Guitar Hero or Rock Band or those kinds of games. The one that we struggle a lot with, we basically have a category for mobile games, which isn't a very well described category. It's just like games that you can easily play on a small tablet or a phone. But those are at least how we break down games, noting that there are lots more kind of niche categories. So like fighting games, like you might have played Mortal Kombat at some point in your life, right?
Yeah.
Like we usually treat that as its own little niche category of games, with Mortal Kombat and trying to think of some of the other really popular ones, Injustice or those types of games. There's a couple more like that. And then within the big categories, there are an incredible number of subcategories. So it's like, oh, I don't like this, this third-person shooter game. Oh, well, maybe you'd like a stealth game rather than what we call a hack and slash. But there's a big space of games that exist in the world. And so, I think given that variety, there tends to be something for everyone if you kind of do a little exploration.
So one bit of gaming that I have played a little bit of, and it's safe for me because it's only been on a friend's house, and I know it's cost prohibitive for me to get a VR at the moment, although I guess it's getting cheaper. But I've gone to a friend's house and been like, okay, I can play this for 5 minutes and take this off and not ruin my life with this. And man, those things are very, very fun for the little bit of, as the VR experience is still so raw and new and problematic, as it's getting better and better, it's going to be such an exciting space. And I was thinking, as you're talking about the fighter games, I was thinking of the Black Mirror episode that I'm sure you saw with the fighter game. Am I correct in assuming you
Nope, I've never seen Black Mirror. I'm a pretty bad television watcher.
Oh, so there's a Black Mirror episode where basically you can insert yourself, like your brain into the fighter character, and like kind of shows some of the consequences of doing that. The reason I bring it up is I was wondering if you could maybe again, I'm just trying to get you in so much trouble with opinionated gamers out there. If you could maybe separate kind of what is science fiction and what is like realistic in terms of the trajectory of gaming and where you maybe see it going, some of the things that you get excited about or worried about.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think VR has potential. There's certainly issues, and some of them might be insurmountable issues. So lots of people, for instance, get what's called simulator sickness when they're in a VR environment, right? You've talked about this, I know, in your comedy, right? You get mismatch between things when you're in a VR system, between your visual system and, say, your vestibular system that's telling you about acceleration through space. And actually in VR, you get significant mismatch just within the visual system. So for instance, we actually have lots of cues that tell us how far away things are. So we have what's called stereopsis. So if you kind of blink your eyes left and right, you get slightly different views of the world in your left and right eye. And you can use that to determine depth. But you can also tell depth by this kind of the thickness of the lens in your eye. It adjusts based on how far away you're focusing. And so in a VR system, those are kind of intractably at odds. They're always going to tell you that things are at different depths. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it's just like the way VR works. But I think as things get smoother, as your head movements are captured better in game, as the field of view increases, as the kind of refresh rate increases, that could be a really fun medium. Although one thing that I think is interesting in that is that there was a lot of interest in games where you could use your body to interact. So for instance, Xbox had the Kinect for a while, where you played the game by if you needed your character to jump over something, you jumped over it. And that didn't end up being as successful as people expected, partially, I think, because people don't necessarily, the reason you play video games is you don't want to be limited by your own body, right? It's like, I can only jump so high. I would just assume my character not be limited by how high I can jump, right? To some extent, you are role-playing a little bit in these games. And so it'll be interesting to see how that is dealt with, right? If it's super kind of tied to your body, well, you might not be a particularly fast fighter, right? Would you rather use your own hands to do it, or would you rather be able to kind of use button presses and kind of role play? I think it's hard to tell, but I don't, based on that progression there, I have no idea if the kind of use of your own body in VR is likely to become a big part of the space or not.
Interesting. Well, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you so much for spending some time during this quarantine to share your perspective. And I can't wait to see you live in person next time I'm in Madison again.
Yeah, whenever you're in Madison and we're allowed to be out and about, we'll look forward to it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Shawn.
Yeah, I know.
And thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll see you next time.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we